A particularly interesting aspect of emotional function involves the growing body of knowledge concerning the genealogy of emotions. According to research conducted at Emory University, mice can pass on learned information about traumatic or stressful experiences to their descendants through their genes. This field of research, known as epigenetics, refers to a phenomenon in which the life experiences of an organism can alter its gene methylation and therefore significantly alter the genetic blueprint its offspring will inherit. In simple terms, your genetics are not set in stone from birth the way many people think it is. Everything from diet to drug use to childhood trauma can radically change your gene expression, and these changes will manifest in the genes of your offspring as well as their offspring, and so on. Research suggests that mice literally pass on their traumatic memories through generations. If you use electric shocks to condition a mouse to fear the smell of cherry blossom, its offspring will show strong signs of exactly the same phobia, despite never having seen or smelled cherry blossom. The offspring they produce will also have the phobia, even if they are produced through artificial insemination and never actually meet their father, demonstrating that the mice are not using some form of communication to teach the phobia to their children. The DNA itself showed chemical alterations on the gene responsible for detecting the type of scent produced by cherry blossom. Apparently, the animal brain has a way of converting experiential memory into genetic information ready to pass on to the next generation. Such a system would be a powerful survival adaptation. There are many things in the EEA that we need to be afraid of, but it's just not realistic for parents of most species to consciously teach these fears to their children. So there is likely a strong selective pressure for evolving a system that automatically transfers fears to your offspring based on your traumatic memories. There is a problem with having this kind of system of inheriting the mental processes that were advantageous to our pre-industrial hunter-gatherer ancestors. The mental processes that kept our ancestors from being slaughtered by wild hyenas may not be so adaptive in the context of a modern urban environment. Adaptation is ultimately filtered through environment, and we live in an incredibly different environment today than we lived in for the vast majority of our history as a species. So why do many modern humans still develop bizarre or irrational phobias? If it's not socially constructed, but it's not selected for by our environment, then what is sustaining this mental process in the population? Phobias seem to have evolved because they were beneficial to our ancestors, who lived in more dangerous environments than ours. But according to the time lag argument, the lifestyle of modern humans has changed and become safer too rapidly for selection pressures to replace our ancient phobic adaptations. In clinical terms, a psychopathology is a behavioral or mental pattern that somehow causes suffering or difficulty in meeting the needs of life. Mental disorders haven't always been seen this way, but looking through the lens of adaptation helps us see how something adaptive like inherited fear can end up causing suffering depending on the environment. In many cases, those with psychopathologies may not actually appear disordered if we thrust them into the kind of environment their genes were adapted for. Simply understanding that what worked for our ancestors does not necessarily work for us has a number of massive consequences on how we look at ourselves. So think about this dynamic as we investigate the adaptive functions and origins of the core human emotions. Can you remember any moments in your life when you felt your innate emotional tendencies caused you more harm than good? The notion that basic emotional expressions are universal and therefore inherited from a common evolutionary ancestor has become popular over the last 30 years, but it has some critics. Fridlund, for example, argues that facial expressions are social tools that we use mostly for manipulation rather than for revealing our true feelings to others. If this is the case, then each society may have developed different expressions to mean different things during normal communications. Smiling, for example, is sometimes used to express sarcasm, and laughter under the right circumstances may be used as a threat. A more hardline version of this argument is that emotions are products of society and have little to do with biology. This is the social constructionist or standard social science model view of human nature. James Averill, for example, has described an emotional state that is observed among the Gururumba, who live in the highlands of New Guinea, which is called being a wild pig. In this state, villagers spend some time running wild like an undomesticated pig. They may commit crimes they normally wouldn't, although they rarely really hurt anyone or take anything of real value. After a while, the wild pig comes home and life goes back to normal with no recriminations. Averill uses this example to defend his claim that most emotional reactions are socially constructed. If evolutionary psychologists are to claim that human emotions are universal, then they need to address these arguments. One response is Ekman's proposal that we should distinguish between basic expressions common to all cultures and complex bodily movements that are learned and may be constructed from the more basic, fundamental expressions. In this sense, the culture-specific expressions can be placed at a level above the basic universal emotions. So the disagreement may be blown out of proportion because social constructionists are focusing at the level of learned cultural differences, while evolutionary psychologists are focusing at a more basic level of innate responses. Ekman also concedes that basic expressions can be consciously modified to take on different meanings under different social circumstances, like in the cultural display rules we talked about. This doesn't mean that the underlying basic expressions do not exist. Another theory is that emotions came about as epiphenomena of evolutionary processes. This means they might be the byproducts of other adaptations with less adaptive significance. Randolph Nesse sees this explanation as highly unlikely, since emotions are not only shared by people of different cultures, they also have clear fitness repercussions. Becoming emotionally attached to partners and offspring is generally a prerequisite to passing on your genes. Likewise, having an instinctual emotional response to signals of danger would have consequences for gene replication. We know that people with serious emotional problems are frequently unable to look after themselves, let alone form stable attachments and raise offspring. Randolph Nesse attempted to precisely specify the situations and selective forces that have shaped each emotion. Consider the possible adaptive functions of the core positive emotions of love and happiness on one hand, and negative emotions of fear, anger, and sadness on the other. Negative emotions are believed to have evolved to allow us to respond appropriately to aversive stimuli. Negative emotions appear to be both more abundant and more specific than positive emotions. Fear and anger, for example, are generally related to very specific events, whereas happiness and love are more ephemeral. Nesse has suggested this greater specificity for negative emotions is because there are more different types of threats than there are different types of positive opportunities. There is also an asymmetry in the consequences of not responding to positive and negative circumstances. Ignoring a mating opportunity might still allow for other opportunities at a later date, but you only get one opportunity to ignore a charging rhino. If you fail and you haven't reproduced yet, your genetic lineage is dead. So selection pressures for negative emotional responses would probably have been both stronger and more specific than the pressures for positive emotions. The one core emotion with the clearest survival implications is fear. People who lack fear do not make for good ancestors. Ekman sees fear as one of the fundamental emotions. Nesse, however, sees a number of subtypes of fear, each of which would augment fitness in a different way. Panic and agoraphobia, for example, are adaptations which prepare the body for attack, both physiologically and psychologically. Blood circulation is rerouted to the muscles, and the mind becomes highly focused on finding escape routes. Evolutionists have argued that negative emotions such as fear and anger generally serve to narrow the focus of attention and increase vigilance. Once we are focused on the object of our negative emotions, we are not easily distracted from them. Evolutionists have also suggested that negative emotions are related to urges to take a specific action. Such urges have been labeled specific action tendencies. Fear relates to the urge to retreat, whereas anger is clearly related to the urge to attack and injure. In both cases, the action is quite specific. But how does sadness fit in with this idea? It is difficult to imagine a specific action tendency for sadness, but it might be argued that sadness creates the urge to withdraw from an action. It is difficult to pin sadness down to a specific action tendency, but this emotion is strange in other ways too. American anthropologist Robert Levi has reported one culture, the Tahitians, where he argues the people have neither the concept of sadness nor even a word for it. But despite lacking a term for sadness, The Tahitians are clearly capable of feeling this emotion. When rejected by a lover, for example, they take on the appearance of sadness and become lethargic. They consider this state a form of illness, however, which is unrelated to the rejection. Although negative emotions are often viewed as adaptive in that they help us to deal immediately with adverse events, one curious aspect of anger is that it often involves spiteful threats or acts which may incur a cost to the actor. This is especially true when the target of our anger is a friend who has disappointed us. In the language of Robert Trivers, we may get angry when anticipated acts of reciprocation fail to materialize. Nesse sees this form of anger as a problem for evolutionary theories of behavior since it may lead to costly and apparently irrational behavior. As Nesse puts it, how can anger possibly be adaptive? Why not just ignore the person who will not cooperate and look instead for a different reciprocity partner? But such anger might be rational in the long run. Anger directed towards friends who have cheated us might show them that we're aware of their defection and will not be victimized again. It might even persuade the defector to make amends with the victim. Without this form of outrage in our repertoire, we would certainly be easy prey for exploitative friends. Nesse also suggests that guilt and self-punishment have evolved partly for the purpose of repairing a relationship following a defection. Barbara Fredrickson believes that positive emotions may be the product of strong selection pressures. In the same sense that fear narrows one's attention, Fredrickson suggests that positive emotions serve to expand an individual's attention. In other words, to broaden our minds. Fredrickson examines 4 basic emotional states. Joy embodies the urge to be playful. Engaging in play promotes the development of both physical and intellectual skills. It also helps you measure the strengths and weaknesses of other members of your social group. By triggering playful behavior, joy may serve long-term social and intellectual functions. Interest is a state that all mentally healthy people feel every day. It motivates us to explore and inquire, and thereby increase our knowledge of the world. Interest involves an urge that is rewarding and pleasurable. When you're truly interested in something, you find it emotionally difficult to resist pursuing it. Contentment is generally seen as a low arousal positive state. Fredrickson argues that contentment creates the urge to savor and integrate recent events and experiences, and that this increases receptiveness. Love is a term used to describe a number of emotionally positive states of strong attachment to another person. It always involves the urge to be close to the target of our affections, as well as a feeling of pleasure when in their company. Fredrickson sees love as helping to build and solidify an individual's social resources, which might be drawn upon later. This implies that love may play a role in the development of reciprocal altruism. If love has arisen via selection processes, then it must have affected inclusive fitness. Passionate love is an obvious state which is likely to boost our direct fitness through reproduction, whereas love of family members is likely to boost both direct and indirect fitness through altruism. In Fredrickson's model, positive emotions have been shaped by selection pressures, not because they allow for immediate life-preserving responses the way negative emotions do, but because they motivate people to build for the future. In this way, positive emotions may be seen as adaptations. Fredrickson cites 2 indirect pieces of evidence to support her theory. First, there is some evidence that people with bipolar disorder are particularly creative during their manic phase, which is when they are happiest. And second, lab-based studies have demonstrated that attentional focus may be broadened during positive emotional states. Nesse claims affectionate emotions evolved to promote aid to family members who share an individual's genes. Interestingly, Nesse also says positive emotions may now be more useful than negative ones because life is safer than it used to be. In 2004, Randolph Nesse proposed what we might call an evolutionary tree of emotions. In other words, its phylogeny. The suggestion here is that ancient organisms began with simple arousal that evolved to deal with threats and opportunities. Later on in evolutionary history, arousal differentiated into multiple responses in order to deal with different adaptive challenges for each species. This eventually led to complex, socially evoked emotional states in species like ours, such as romantic love, pride, and shame. As Nesse has pointed out, this illustration is a simplification, since the tree will be different for different species. The actual pathways would have many dead ends, and selection can undifferentiate specific emotions to deal with more general situations. Also, of course, the diagram should be in about 20 dimensions.